È già partito.
So, we are online. Ma siamo anche su YouTube?
Sì.
Già, e dobbiamo aspettare gli altri relatori, interrompi un attimo.
Sì, interrompiamo. Vedono momentaneamente.
So, good morning. Welcome to the final roundtable of the 5th edition of the Business and Human Rights Summer School. We are in Procida, in such a wonderful island, and this is the 5th day, so the final day of this 5th edition of the Business and Human Rights Summer School. And so we have decided to devote the final roundtable to what's one of the most challenging topics in the field of business and human rights currently. That is the recently adopted proposal for European directive on corporate sustainability due diligence. So we have a panel of very distinguished speakers that I would like to thank very much for their availability to be here or online. And in a brief, I will introduce them. But first of all, let me also express the thanks by my name is Angelica Bonfanti, and also the thanks for to all the staff here convened by my three colleagues who have with me co-directed the summer school, Marco Fasciglione, Chiara Macchi, and Marta Bordignon. So I go directly to the introduction of the speakers who actually wouldn't need to be introduced as they are very distinguished and well known. And so just to give a brief summary of the main activities in this field. Today we have with us Fabrizio Petri, who has served as an Italian diplomat and is the plenipotentiary ministry. Currently is the president of the Interministerial Committee for Human Rights. And since November 2021 is also the special envoy of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs for Human Rights and LGBT plus persons. Then we have Ms. Heidi Hautala that I see connected online. And Ms. Heidi Hautala is the Vice President of the European Parliament as a member of the European Parliament in the Greens ACA group. She serves on the Committee on International Trade and the Subcommittee on Human Rights. In 2017, she established the Working Group on Responsible Business Conduct in the European Parliament. So we are very grateful to her for being here, and we thank her very much for her availability. Then, instead, here in presence with us, we have Michael Addo. Professor Michael Addo is Professor of Law at the University of Notre Dame Law School, where he is also Director of the London Law Programme. Michael Addo has previously served at the Universities of Exeter and Sheffield, and he has been a member of the United Nations Working Group on Business and Human Rights. So, and he has also been the chair of the Coordination Committee of the United Nations Special Procedures. So we are very happy and grateful to have him with us today. And we have other two very distinguished speakers here at the table with us, who are respectively Silvia Obregon, who is Policy Officer at the European Coalition for Corporate Justice. So she is one of the voices, of the most relevant voices of the civil society in this process of negotiation of the new directive. So she currently facilitates an NGO advocacy coalition, the Corporate Coalition of Corporate Justice, in this process of negotiations towards the introduction of new duties on corporations. And last but not least, Andrea Schemberg, who has served as legal advisor at the UN Secretary General Special Representative on Business and Human Rights, John Ruggie, from 2007 to 2011. She has worked for different universities. She has been a counselor to NGOs, such as in Amnesty International and the International Commission of Jurists in Geneva. And currently she is the chair of the Global Business Initiative on Human Rights. So we have an incredibly great panel of speakers. And again, my thanks to all of them for being here. And we will have a discussion on the directive proposal that promised to be a very in-depth and inspiring discussion. So I would, first of all, just remind that the directive proposal was adopted on the 23rd of February. But this is the outcome of a long process of negotiation somehow that started at least some here in February, when the European Parliament adopted a resolution that was such a legislative initiative to recommend the European Commission to adopt a directive proposal in this field. The resolution adopted last year and the directive proposal adopted in February differ under different points of view. The text we have is a fundamental text in the field of business and human rights. If adopted, when adopted, it will establish duties on corporations in the field of environmental and human rights due diligence on the biggest corporations and medium-large companies in the three high impact sectors, European and non-European companies, and that's something very relevant. And also the directive proposal objective is to establish a regime of civil liability on corporations that cause abuses in this field when related to the lack of implementation of the duties. So is there is a comment, Andre, if you can read it. I propose to structure this discussion today in 3 steps. So I would like, first of all, to give the floor to Ministry Fabrizio Petri, and I would like very much to hear from his voice, which is the position of the Italian government in the field of business and human rights, and what are we practically doing in this area. And afterwards, I will ask the speakers to give their position on the currently adopted test, and we will have time to go in depth on several vertical topics and points of attention, and also have the time to debate about that. And we will also have some time left at the end of the roundtable for the Q&A. So first of all, I see him online, Ministry Petri. I see him connected, but I don't see him on the screen. Can you help me, maybe? Sorry for these technical issues.
Can you hear me?
Yeah. Now we can see you, Fabrizio. A minute, because we cannot hear you.
Okay, can you hear us?
I can hear you very well.
Perfect.
Okay. So
okay.
Very well.
Good morning. Good morning, Ministro Petri. Nice to see you.
Pleasure for me. A pleasure for me. Thank you so much. Thank you so much for inviting me, and thank you so much for creating this occasion. Of course, what you are doing since some years is becoming a wonderful reality, and I'm very happy that I am invited to this occasion. I'm sorry that I could not intervene also before. I was abroad, but really thank you so much. As the people may know, some of them, there are some friends. I would like to say to Professor Addo that I remember we met already a few years ago several times, because the committee that I'm president of, the Italian Interministerial Committee for Human Rights, is the national mechanism for reporting and follow-up. We are the counterpart of the human rights machinery of the United Nations. So we are the one who have the dialogue with the treaty bodies on one side, with the council as far as the Italian Universal Periodic Review is concerned, and with the special procedures also. So the working group of business human rights, Professor Addo was the president for quite some time, is a special procedure, and we work a lot with them. They came to visit Italy last October. So really, for me, it's a pleasure again. Hello to Professor Addo, and thank you to all of you for inviting me. In fact, we are looking forward to the directive of the European Union. So far in Italy, we have applied what is considered the best instrument so far that we have, which are the principles of business human rights of the United Nations 2011. And we have released 2 national plans. The first one in 2016, we were at that time only a few countries. We were the 9th countries to release a plan. And it was a 5-year plan. We revised it in 2018. And now in 2021, just last December, the 10th of December, we released the second action plan on business human rights. Is a 5-year plan. Of course, the plan is already structured in a way that we can accommodate, as we hope, the directive of the European Union. As you well know, there is already a directive on non-financial communication that is already an important directive on the issue. So, but basically, we have this system of national action plan. I must say that the Italian national action plan is quite a structured plan. And above all, is a plan, the new plan, that is completely linked to the other national plan that Italy has, and is a plan that has indicators. So we are extremely happy of this development. The first national plan did not have indicators. This action plan has indicators. So it's a national plan that is really structured in a way that can be used, let's say, really, we hope that they can be used to improve the application, the implementation in Italy of the principle of business human right. So, first thing, the entire NAP and National Action Plan is promoted and monitored in the framework of a working group on business human right that has been created by my committee. So, and whose members are representative of all the central administration concerned and covered for the national plan. So there is a steering committee, we can call it like that, that oversees the implementation of the plan. So this is the first thing. The second thing, the meetings, this steering committee has several meetings every year, and one of the meetings is always with the civil society and multi-stakeholder meeting. I would like to remember that last year, to arrive to the second national action plan, we had two important interaction with multi-stakeholder. We had a first in February, March, in which we asked an assessment of the situation according to the implementation of the first national plan. Then on the basis of this public hearing, we then designed and the new action plan, and the new national plan was then put again in a public hearing on between September and October. So we had the two sessions of involvement of civil society, trade union, enterprises, human rights defender, academic experts, and so on and so forth. So this dialogue, it does not end with the release of the national plan, but it's a constant in our work. So every year we have a special meeting. The steering committee for the implementation of the national action plan has a meeting also, stakeholder meeting in the second part of the year. So this is also something very important for us. I would like also to stress that all the commitments undertaken in the second National Action Plan on Business Human Rights for the better implementation of the United Nations Guiding Principle will be modeled through really indicators that they might effectively guide the legislative, regulatory, and administrative institutional action at the domestic level. Really, it's very important for us that this indicator will be used in a constructive manner. All the administration are collaborating in this. Quantitative and qualitative performance indicators so have been in fact endorsed by all administration, and they have it took us like 2 months of work on this. Systematic promotion of business human rights issues is also very important for us in all the relevant international fora. It's an essential part of a universal vision of human rights, sustainable development, democracy, and rule of law. For us, is very, very important the link with this, the goal number 16. The goal number 16, the rule of law, is very important. In this context, the application of the guiding principle should also be promoted in relation to the development sustainable goals. We named some of them, the 4th, the 5th, the 8th, the 10th, the 12th, and as I said, the 16th. Also, the 17th is very important. But the whole of the guiding principle, of the sustainable development goals are important in our view, and they are all interlinked in our national plan. So also we have, the plan is extremely wide. We touched environmental issues, health issues, decent work, human rights defenders, and we have also, and is also connected to the National Recovery and Resilience Plan. So this is also very important. Also, we have issues related to technological development and artificial intelligence in order to highlight the possible impact on the enjoyment of human rights, to corporate due diligence, and issues related to activities promoted by cultural companies strongly impact the promotion of human rights. Also, there is a special attention on the most vulnerable groups. That was already in the first national plan, but in the second national plan, it's really has been really widened. So women and girls, children and adolescents, persons with disability, LGBT+ person, migrants and asylum seekers, persons belonging to ethnic and religious minorities, older persons. All these categories are really present in the plan, and there are measures for that. So for us, the whole idea is that this is the way that Italy is using to keep pace with the development that there are internationally on the field of business human rights. But we are very interested to see what will happen at the level of European Union, because we strongly believe that it's high time for a better and more compulsory system. So we are extremely happy of what is happening at the European Union level. And I think that meetings like the one of today are very important to understand better for the big public the issues at stake. So thank you again. And of course, I cannot follow the entire session, but you can rest assured with all of the Italian members, from Professoressa Bonfanti to Professor Fasciglione, we are constantly in touch. So I will be talking to them afterwards to really understand which was the final of this very important session. So thank you again and congratulations for your work.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Fabrizio. Thank you very much, Minister Petri, for your words. And we are grateful for the work you are doing, and we very look in the same direction. So thanks for sharing your point of view. Thanks. Now we can start the discussion about the directive proposal, and I would like to give, first of all, the floor to Ms. Heidi Hautala, who I don't see yet on the screen, but maybe it's my problem. So just again, 1 second.
Hello.
Hello, yeah, you are. Nice to meet you, and thanks, Ms. Hautala, for being here. We are very grateful, and we look very much forward to hear from your voice, the work the European Parliament has done and is going to do with regard to the adoption of the directive, and your point of view and your position as being so much involved in this process. So please.
Yeah, thank you. I was very pleased to hear how committed Italy is to the National Action Plan on Business and Human Rights, and that there is an inclusive process and review mechanism to update it. So that's excellent, because as we know, sadly, not all EU member states have a National Action Plan. And even worse is that the EU never managed to put together one. There were serious attempts about 5 years ago, but I assume that one of the reasons why the EU never managed to do that was that it was referred back to the member states. But then secondly, I think there was quite a rivalries between the different parts of the European Commission. So it wasn't clear who would be responsible. So now where we are, as Minister has also mentioned, the European Commission has come up with a legislative proposal, and I assume that you have already discussed it in many contexts of your summer school week. The European Parliament will start the serious work to deal with the Commission's proposals in September. There's been quite a delay. First of all, there was a delay with the Commission's proposal. There were 2 negative statements by the so-called Regulatory Scrutiny Board. But at the end of the day, the commissioners felt that, look, we've done what we need to do, and now we will pass this legislation to the European Parliament and to the Council. So in a way, I think this whole, should I call it a fuss around the Regulatory Scrutiny Board's negative opinions, which, by the way, is not unique at all. It happens from time to time to legislative proposals. So it was, let's say, this board was in a way shown its place. It's still an informal advisory within the European Commission. So then we saw that a lot of groundwork has been done already, not least in the interaction between the European Parliament, the civil society, progressive businesses, business associations, different DGs in the European Commission. So the European Parliament will be able to refer in many instances dealing with the Commission's proposal back to its legislative resolution from March the 10th of 2021, so well over almost 1.5 years ago, which was very well received by everyone who is acquainted with the UN guiding principles of business and human rights. And I would like to say that the first issue that we need to deal with, and a kind of an overarching issue in the Commission's proposal, is that it is not really aligned with the UN guiding principles and the respective OECD guidelines. And here we need to look at several aspects. First of all, the Commission seems to hold that the size of the company is a serious denominator to the risks, adverse impacts it will have on human rights. So that's something that I must confess that also the European Parliament was struggling with, because there's quite a strong lobby from SMEs in Europe and in member states certainly as well, who kind of are concerned about the regulatory burden that they would have to face if the companies would be in the scope of the regulation. But anyway, so the scope is quite limited. 1% of companies, as far as I can understand, in the European internal market, but it's the share of the turnover is much higher, up to 50%, I understand. So we need to look at the scope. And then there are some novel concepts which are not derived from the UNGP and OECD guidelines. The main problem here I see is from what is now called established business relationships. It is exclusive of many other business relationships, short-term and different partnerships that don't have to be established. So we need to look at the definition of the scope in this respect is going to be more comprehensive. Then one colleague in the European Parliament said that what the Commission proposes in terms of the due diligence process is a bit like outsourcing due diligence. And this is, I think, oddly true, because the Commission proposes a kind of a contract-based due diligence. It does raise concerns. The text of the Commission implies that companies could fulfill their due diligence obligations by contractual assurances with suppliers. And so they could offload the verification process to third parties. So in a way, they would cascade the responsibility. And at the end of the day, the company could wash its hands of different issues and violations that occur in their supply chains and in their value chains. So I think this is one of the main things that need to be remedied. Then we can never be too explicit about a meaningful engagement with stakeholders. And the issue that I'd like to point out in the Commission's proposal is that they propose that meaningful engagement or engagement with stakeholders should be done only where relevant. And for me, it's always relevant. Engagement with stakeholders is a wonderful source of information to the company leadership to understand in which kind of operating environment they are, what their impact on their environment is, and what is the impact of their milieu, the environment on their activities. So And I would like to point out for one thing, if I have still 1 or 2 minutes, perhaps.
For sure.
I think lately there's been a lot of focus on the situation of human rights defenders. And why I raise it here is that I feel that many companies are not at all in meaningful engagement with local populations or indigenous peoples. And now we see from an analysis by Frontline Defenders, a major organization working with human rights defenders, that at least 358 murders of human rights activists happened globally in 2021. And now the most important in this respect, nearly 60% were land, environment, and indigenous rights defenders. So we see very much where the risks are, that anything that has to do with land use and land use change is risky, and it is very risky to people who defend their land rights. Very often governments are corrupt and there are conflicts of interest in decision making. So I would very much suggest that we all together, we need to make sure that this engagement with stakeholders is meaningful and that it not just where relevant. So maybe in the further discussion, we will discuss the question of access to justice and civil liability, but I prefer to keep it to this so we see what other panelists have to say. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So, Ms. Hautala, I thank you very much for your words, for your point of view, and also for your, I feel comforted by the fact that these points, which seem to be strengthened, are on the agenda. I share with you that there are still some aspects to be improved, and I'm happy that they are on your agenda. So thank you very much for these. Now, as you said, we would like also to hear the voice of the speakers here, and I would like to start with Michael Addo. So, Michael, what's your position on this directive proposal?
Right. Well, first of all, I must thank you for the very kind invitation, because I think this kind of gives me an interesting perspective on the progress on business and human rights. But more importantly, it gives me a chance to meet some old friends like Andrea and Fabrizio and all of these people whom COVID kind of separated us from. Very nice to meet you, to Miss Heidi Hetler. We haven't met, so I hope we get a chance to meet. But more importantly, I'm so excited to see a room full of young people, because actually this subject lies in their hands. It's kind of one of those evolving subjects that needs a change of baton. And I think the baton is in fairly safe hands, and thanks to your summer school. So it's so nice to see you all here. In terms of my opinion, and I'm going to speak directly to the young people, and it's very simple. Make no mistake about this. This is a big deal. As far as business and human rights is concerned, this development is big time game changer. So keep an eye on it, work with it, and it's going to be different. And I'm saying this from kind of long experience, and I'm going back to the days when they used to talk about a code of conduct. And at that point, it was the OECD that changed the game. Now we have conversations about the binding instrument, the UNGPs, and that's what I think we are seeing now is that game changer. So really very significant to do it, to bear that in mind. But there are a number of things that I really want to praise about this development. I do have one or two things that I also want to support Ms. Hetler's comments in a moment. First of all, I think this is a big deal because it's joining the dots. And it's joining the dots in a whole variety of ways. We all look up to the UNGPs, but the UNGP is a very broad, what people describe as your 30,000 feet kind of principles. They're very general and they don't tie anybody down. But actually, that's fine. That's what I call the first order principle. It's so useful to have second order where a particular group of institutions are reinterpreting and expanding the UNGPs. And I think that's what the directive is seeking to do, to kind of make this operational. And so that's second order. And then a third order that will then require that states at national level begin to kick this into operation And that's quite useful that we are getting a connection between the UNGPs, the directive, national law, and hopefully corporate policy. And that's what is so useful about it. But it's also very significant because joining the dots, because it's beginning to join dots that are sitting normally differently. And one of the key is the dot between human rights and environment. It's a no-brainer, but for years, that connection wasn't made very clear sufficiently. I mean, in the SDGs, it's been attempted, but it's not quite as direct as this one. So this is quite significant that it's useful. And it is useful because the environment has a pedigree in law, has a pedigree in compliance. So it's useful now to begin to think when we talk about human rights, we're talking the same language as companies have been comfortable with about environmental compliance and climate change. So we are suddenly getting traction. So it is quite important. Now, this then gives me hope that the dots, some more dots will be joined. And some of the dots that have not been joined, but this may be a beginning, is trade, finance, relationship between human rights and profit. Maybe with this, we can now begin to encourage dots being joined between human rights and trade, human rights and finance. And so, I mean it, this is a game changer. Let's hope it can be done. So that's kind of my first point. The second point, and I know we often overlook this, is this reference in the directive to value chain. Most references are to supply chains, and supply chains are often, identified, specific. But the value chain is much more upstream, downstream, production, and use. And also, it doesn't necessarily have to have, I know we refer to established relations. No, a supply chain can very well be on your blind side, and you really need. So it's actually trying to hit much more how companies operate than, and I think in that sense, in my view anyway, I think it sits comfortably with the UNGP's reference to being directly linked in UNGP 17 and 22 and so on. So I think in that sense, we should be taking that concept seriously. Now, we will talk a little bit more about some of the even better things, but for the moment, let me refer, and I know you want my views on this, so I should say one or two things about to join Ms. Hessler about some of the things that could be a source of difficulty. And I know, and I should say this, that the product here is a source of serious negotiation. And I know reference was made between the Commission and the Parliament, but I promise you, it's behind the scenes, the companies are pushing, governments are pushing. So the milieu of negotiation is much messier than just the Commission and the Parliament. So to get something out of all of this is great. All right, we agree that, but we can, like a school report, great student, but can do better. Now, one of the things that worries me is just flavor of national discretion throughout the directive. Now, my worry is that for years, it's been that difficulty for the states, national authorities to deal with companies. And then I find the Commission and the Parliament, the EU, is referring back to national authorities to do this. Okay, with a bit of guidance here and there. But I'm thinking, can we trust that these entities can deal with it? So I'm not so sure. Maybe they can, but that's my first concern. The second concern, which relates to Ms. Hetler's point, but I thought I should relate, is this kind of credibility question. And credibility because if you're a second order set of norms drawing from the first order, then you have to be faithful to the first order. And there's good reason why the first order has become accepted. And this idea of the scope, really, we must think carefully. Whereas the UNGP wants to cover, make sure that it covers all companies. Cutting this to that limited scope will be a bit of a problem. And I heard Suradiva in his keynote address saying the EU spent all their life fighting Ecuador and the binding instrument on the footnote that seeks to remove non-TNCs from the scope, and they would never negotiate it. And then suddenly the EU gets a chance to really write something like this, and they do exactly the same thing. You think credibility? That's it. But as I said, it's a negotiation point, and that. But in the end, somebody had done some kind of data analysis, and he said, "Yeah, they'll cover about 20,000 companies." Hello, I mean, if you don't cover anything less than 1 million, you're not getting anywhere. But even better still, if you look at the economic structure of most countries, nearly every country has 90% or more of its economic activity driven by SMEs. I would have preferred for this to focus on SMEs, forget the TNCs, because if you can conquer the SMEs, you're really going to make a difference. Somehow we didn't quite get that. My other concern was that I've read through the narrative and I've read through a lot of the summaries. Where's the global south? I mean, this is a world global issue. It's not an EU issue. I would have wished for a lot more consultation in the global south. After all, that's where these companies are alleged to be causing an issue. So you're writing something like this, and you don't kind of engage fully with the global south. And okay, there have been some consultations here and there, but I would have brought much more determined. So my general view is, it's great. Let's look at it. I will have some ideas and suggestions towards the next part about how I think this can actually work. It's naive, but I'm thinking it can work, and there are ways to make it work. So I think it's a great initiative, fantastic potential. Let's see where it goes.
Thank you very much, Michael, for your overall view on the directive proposal and for emphasizing both the pros and some of the cons. So you have already started the discussion, I would say, on the topics we will deal with more in depth later. So thank you very much. Now I would like to also. Sorry. It was part two, but included, let's say, sorry. So now I would like also to hear the voice of Silvia Obregon. May I ask you to sit here and we exchange? Thank you.
Well, thank you very much for the invitation again, and it's really great to be here with you and with this introduction from Ms. Hautala and Mr. Addo. There is not a lot to add, but I do want to emphasize on a few aspects and maybe start following the example of Mr. Addo with the positive aspects. I think that one of the things of the positive elements of the directive is that it's moving towards mandatory due diligence. So we heard the ministry, Fabrizio Pietri, talking about the NAPs, and this is great that they are putting so much emphasis on the NAPs and that there is a commitment on the NAPs, but we need more than voluntary, and this has been proven in the past 10 years in the attempts at implementing the UNGPs and the OECD guidelines, and the very little compliance that there is with these very good instruments has rendered them not as efficient as they should be today. So the part of mandatory due diligence that this directive is putting in place, the first of its kind on a regional instrument following the lead of two member states, France and Germany, it's a very important step forward to make it mandatory. The second thing I would like to add as a positive is precisely on how to enforce this mandatory character. And the directive takes a double approach, building from both the German and the French national laws, and bringing in both public and private enforcement into the mix. Each of them have their pros and cons and their flaws, and they need to be improved, in particular the civil liability aspects. But the fact that there is a civil liability article already is something that we need to defend, or we're defending as civil society, and that we know that the parliament is an ally in defending it because it was part of their INL in 2021 in March. And that we know in Brussels that this is going to be a contentious point for some of the member states, but we will get into the details of civil liability maybe later on. But the fact that there is civil liability complementary to enforcement, and because indeed the national enforcement is going to be complicated. Right now, the provisions are relatively good in a general sense, but then we have been hearing from member states concerned about, like, where are we going to get the resources to make this happen? And for instance, in Germany, the enforcement based mainly only on administrative liability. They calculated that the BAFA, this institution that was going to follow up the national supply chain law, would need 160 employees. To date, they have hired 6, and there is plans to hire 20. in the next year or so. So it's an issue of resources as well. And that's why, amongst many other reasons, that it's so important that the directive brings in these two aspects of civil and public private and public enforcement. Maybe another positive instrument, the human rights and environmental marriage. It's still very clear that there is little knowledge of environmental due diligence in the hands of those that were drafting the instrument, that came mainly from the inspiration of the OECD guidelines and the UNGPs. And we see clearly that there is an attempt at aligning the due diligence article refers to the 6 steps of the OECD guidelines. There is a reference generally that this is in line with UNGP in several aspects, but in the detail we see a massive disalignment, and then I guess that we will always all go into the detail later on in the second session that Angelica has prepared for us. But there is this dichotomy of the attempt to align, but then in the detail failing to really capture the essence of the instrument. One more thing that for me it's important is, well, in the sense of the European landscape, is the horizontal harmonization. The fact that the directive would provide a floor of what is the minimum that European companies are required to do in the EU in global value chains, and that it also tries to include non-European companies participating or operating in the EU market. So this is like the positive side. Then on the negative side, I join you in everything you said. And maybe I would like to add that, well, on the due diligence duty is highly process-based. It has missed part of the spirit of the due diligence obligations by not putting forward an obligation to prevent first and foremost before laying out the process. That's also something that we can discuss later. The way that climate was integrated was kind of like a last minute thing. And if some of you have had the opportunity to follow very closely, there was a leak of the proposal just a month or two before the publication of the proposal. And in that one, there was no climate. And then all of a sudden there was climate. Yeah, we believe that it's due to the push of civil society and certain member states that were interested, and particularly also the parliament. But it is clearly disjointed from the rest of the directive. It's not linked to the due diligence duty. It's separated from the civil liability, a little bit messy in the way that it connects with the annex or not. So we see that. There is a clear lack of inclusion of stakeholder engagement, and I join Ms. Hautala in that. It's extremely important, the role that the OECD guidelines and the UNGPs in particular have given to stakeholder engagement by making it an ongoing part of the due diligence process. And this was completely missed in the way that the stakeholders have been included in the directive, and in that sense also the way that protection, for instance, for stakeholders engaging with companies in certain scenarios that are foreseen in the directive, it's missing. There is like a reference to the whistleblower protection in Article 23, but it's very vague. It's not, it doesn't capture the nuances and the difficulties of the people in the ground on this. And maybe to not go longer, I would like to also point out that here, if you look at the room, we are mainly women in many sectors, tourism, electronics, textile, etc., etc. Value chains are predominantly women as well, and the directive is gender blind in its majority. It fails to address issues of intersectionality in the way that how impacts affect different groups in a different manner. And this is not included in the way that the directive is conceived. So I think that this is something that we also need to address. With regards to the scope, that it's a super contentious point indeed all the time. I just wanted to add one data statistic. It's 0.02 of the European companies that it's going to be covered by the current scope. That's nothing. It is the big fish, but these big fish are going to be able to push the responsibility down the value chain with the contractual cascading and contractual assurance, I think. So on one side, we have had in civil society discussions on whether, okay, do we prioritize as civil society the push for the full scope or for a stronger due diligence duty or the full value chain, or it's impossible sometimes. It's so intertwined, it's so interconnected that, yeah, we really need to align more with the UNGP and the OECD guidelines also in the matter of scope, which is highly political, and there are no reasons or evidence for these decisions other than political choices.
Thank you, Silvia. Thank you, Silvia. Now I would like to ask to Andrea to give her position.
Hi, everyone. Can I just ask a question? How many of you are non-lawyers? Non-lawyers, great. Okay, and I asked that question because sometimes it's really easy when you're looking at a proposal for a law to think of it as a lawyer. And I want us to also think beyond the law and think about people who want to make change in the world, right? So we want to achieve change. And I think listening to us, and you're going to hear my comments too, we're going to be aligned. And why is that? And you might disagree, but I actually think the reason that all of us from different perspectives have such similar, very specific critiques of this directive, it's the UN guiding principles at work, right? It's the consensus that was built through the UN guiding principles. And that's why we think the same way. You're a professor, I work with the Global Business Initiative, you're an NGO, but we all have the same, and listening to Ms. Hakla, we all have the same take, right? It's very interesting to me. So as you know, I worked with John Ruggie, so I was part of the team that developed the UN guiding principles, so I might be biased on that. But now I chair an organization called the Global Business Initiative, which is an organization of 23 multinational companies. They're the big fish. And what we do with them is we work on implementing the UN guiding principles. But everything I say today is in my personal capacity. So I am not speaking on behalf of GBI. I am not speaking on behalf of any GBI company, and we never do that. But I do just think it's extremely interesting. And if we think about the last 10 years, and I've been doing a lot of reflecting because of the 10-year anniversary of the UN guiding principles last year. And one of the fundamental changes that the UN guiding principles brought was this consensus on language, right? And we can have a conversation because we use the same words, we use the same language, and we mean the same thing with those words. And that is, I think, one of the parts of the theory of change that John Ruggie implemented in the UN guiding principles. And I don't know what in the next section, when we have a little bit longer, I'll talk to you more about that theory of change and how it relates to this directive. But for this first short pro and con, let me just say, the idea that the European directive is coming out in and of itself, the whole discussion around it is normalizing the idea that we regulate companies with respect to their human rights responsibilities. That is big. It is now no longer in Europe is it a discussion about whether to regulate, right? And those of us who worked in NGOs back in 2002, right? It was all about voluntary, mandatory, voluntary, mandatory. We have effectively ended that discussion. We are now talking about how to regulate. And the fact that you guys, when you go out and you're in your professional lives, you're going to be talking about how to regulate. You're standing on the shoulders of people who were not that lucky. And the other thing that I think is really important is that in words and the details we have to get to, but in the preambular language and in its intent, the directive is building on international standards, right? They refer to the UN guiding principles. They refer to the OECD guidelines. That's super important because it's years of consensus building that then can contribute to achieving something in Europe. And I think it then is important for consolidating those of us who also think in poli-sci terms, right? You think about norm cascading and you think about things becoming the way we think about the world, right? It's normalizing this idea. So I think that that's super important. And then I would say on the negative side, it's all about what you've already said, misalignments, right? There are risks with misalignments, serious risks. And one of the reasons that we have companies supporting this directive is that they want legal certainty. If you define the law in a way that is unlike what they've known for the last 10 years and have been working towards, that doesn't create legal certainty. That creates chaos. Who rules inside my company? Is it the legal office on compliance, or is it my sustainability and human rights department that's telling me to do this? So we have to be worried about that. And I also worry that if the European directive is misaligned to the UN guiding principles, it can do harm to the normative basis, right? It can do harm to the value of the UN guiding principles and to the value of the OECD guidelines, because you set up companies to decide compliance or abide by international standards. And I think that's really dangerous. And then the level playing field, right? Then we're going to have a European idea of what human rights due diligence is, and that will influence legislation around the world. And then we're in a new world, right? And it's been negotiated, and it's not built on the consensus that we have. So I think I'll stop there and we'll get to the details, but that was my pro and con.
So thanks, Andrea. Thank you very much for all your comments. Now, we have put a lot of different legal issues on the table, and we just have to decide where we want to start from. Now, I would divide the second part of the discussion, as I said before, in different topics of attention. So the first topic I would like to address concerns the implementation mechanism, I would say, of this directive. So I would like to ask to Michael Addo his position on that, if you can talk us about the supervisory authorities and the other topics related.
Okay. Well, first of all, again, I'm sure you gathered that I'm a great fan of this directive, despite everything else that we've all said. We really want to help this thing to work. And one of its innovative, well, if not innovative, one of its sincere mechanisms is taking the operational to the implementation. If you cannot implement the thing that you're proposing, it just stays in the air. And so it's great that they've come up with this implementation structure in the directive. And it requires every state to set up something called a supervisory authority. Now, the key is in the language, and this is critical. The idea is that it's not a court, it is not a committee, it's a supervisory body. Now, that word alone means that the primary responsibility lies somewhere else. And this body must oversight. Now, you take it whichever way you want. It could be good, it could be dangerous, and don't let me get into that. But the point is that it does not have the primary responsibility. Where does the primary responsibility lie? It will lie with the companies themselves. Now, again, pros and cons about whether this is a good approach or not. But what it also really tells you is that it's probably not going to be a very strong body. I don't know. Ms. Ertela will tell us. The phrase supervisory body is used with something like the UN's treaty bodies. These are supervisory entities. And the national contact points of the OECD are supervisory bodies. National preventive mechanisms of the Torture Committee, these are preventive bodies and supervisory bodies. And in all of these instances, we see a diversity of entities. Now, again, I would have loved to be a fly on the wall to thinking, when you chose that phrase, a supervisory body, did you have in mind a body that could be like the NCP, could it be like the UN treaty bodies. But the important thing is that it's an innovative, interesting way to do it. But there are other bits of that definition of the implementation process, which is critical. It says that the state can have one or more bodies to do this. It doesn't say whether it's going to be a new body or whether it's going to be an existing body, which then tells me that it's an open question. Number one, what you then see there is the discretion to the state. And as you know, in my first part, I'm a little bit worried about giving this discretion to the state instead of telling them what you think it should be done. Anyway, now, if you have more than one body, where are you going to, how are you going to define the boundaries? Now, I can imagine a whole variety of ways in which these boundaries could be defined by a particular country. They can decide, okay, we're going to allocate particular supervisory bodies by sector. So the mining bodies will have their own supervisory body. The apparel industry will have their own body. The pharmaceuticals will have their own body. Now, I can go on about the pros and cons of that, but I want you to be thinking about this while I unravel this. So, or you can decide to make it on account of turnover. So we have the 500,000 or more, and then below. So you can say, okay, those in the section 2.1 group, the 500,000 or more, you are your own supervisory body. And those of you below, you have your own supervisory body. Or you can decide to say, well, we'll do it by geography. So in Italy, companies in the north, companies in Milan, companies in Naples, because economic geography is different, so you can't impose Milanese kind of business standards on the Nepalese. I don't know. I mean, in some countries, this is significant. So again, that could be that. Or you could even decide to make it like they do with the national human rights institutions, by performance only. Those of you who are performing very well under the directive are category A. So like an incentive for you to build that. Those of you who are not so perfect, but they are doing well, you're category B. Then the rest of you who are rubbish, you're category C. So then the idea is that we're going to break you up so that new supervisory bodies to encourage you to come from C to B and then B to C. And so if you don't do well, we drop you from A to B. I don't know. Again, there is potential there to be able to but in all of this, it's great because the drive behind it is that we need some form of accountability. We need somebody to hold the reins and challenge them to ask questions. So it's a source of, questioning to the companies, which is quite important in each country. Now, it does also say, I know I've reflected on the uncertainty. It says that the state must guarantee independence of the agency. Well, and that the members who work there must act on their own behalf. And I like this very much. The idea is that you're going to get some very strong hands, some very determined entity that's going to ask the difficult questions, including ask the government agency concerned, ask companies some very difficult questions and so on. But I'll come back to my little concerns. And so you can actually get great independence. That their power, they should be given powers that ensure that the authority is legally and functionally independent from companies. You couldn't put it better. That's great. None of this, you can't give us money and keep our mouth shut. It's looking like the thing is looking in. However, the directive doesn't say how these people are appointed or elected. I mean, it seems like a very small matter, but I can tell you that I can make you very independent if I pick my friends. I can make you independent if I know you already you were the former CEO of General Electric. You from now on, don't talk to me, but I know what you're going to be thinking. So the appointment process, which is not mentioned there, could be quite a big gap. In a sense, you could end up with an entity that's very sympathetic to the company or one that won't drive anything. So again, appointment is quite important. It does say that, and expressly, it says that the entity should be independent from companies. How about independent from government? I mean, it says they should be independent. I think that's what they mean. But I think it should be a lot more express to say, you are completely funded from some consolidated fund. Whatever happens, you would never run out of money. We will never sack you. No, you do your job now. I wish they said something. If you're saying that in relation to the companies, you should say. But with the nature side, what powers do they have? Well, they have a whole variety of powers, including they can request information. Give us information about your supply chain or your value chain. They can undertake investigations. on their own account or on account of information that NGOs give them under Article 19, what they call substantiated consent. They can get it on their own research, which I think is a great idea to undertake. Again, a lot will depend upon who is appointed, how they want to carry this forward. In addition, they can conduct inspections. The directive says, but these inspections should be done under two conditions. They must be in accordance with national law and with notice to the company. So unless to give them notice will ruin the effectiveness, what is the chance that you're going to do this on a surprise inspection of, the pharmaceutical company? I'm not so sure. And then they can also seek the support of other European countries. So you can see it could be worthwhile when they're doing these investigations or these inspections. But what happens when they have failed, when companies have failed to comply? It does say that this entity, the supervisory body, can give companies appropriate time. So you give them notice, say you are breaching your directive obligations, we'll give you 3 weeks to rectify this. But at the same time, we can impose administrative sanctions. My question is, how wide are these administrative sanctions? How narrow are these administrative sanctions? Can we go to the point where we can decide, no, forgive me, let me go crazy. We're going to wind the company up. That's it. From now on, because of what you've done, can they go that far? I'm not so sure. It'll be interesting to see what administrative sanctions can be imposed. They can also trigger civil liability, which is great. But when they trigger the civil liability again, and they go and claim damages on this, it has to be judged on account of the turnover of the company. If you're a big company, we fine you more. If you're a small company, we fine you small. What if it's the small company that's causing more of the harm? The big company is causing small harm. And you think, well, you're a small company, you've killed 50,000 people, but you're a small company, we'll fine you £2,000. I'm sorry, for those who have gone through the trouble of drafting it, this one, I think is stupid. But, I don't know why. But if you want to open up the civil liability, open it up. Don't tie their hands to turnover, and that could be a problem. They can also impose pecuniary sanctions, as in financial sanctions. Sorry, it's a financial sanction that's on turnover, not the administrative sanction. But the administrative sanctions have to be proportionate and dissuasive. Shall I read into proportionate and dissuasive punitive as well? I mean, what does it take to dissuade somebody? And if you mean to dissuade them by hurting them where it hurts, we know where it hurts. It hurts in the pocket. So forget this about dissuasive. Punitive sounds to me like a better word. We say, if you want to impose it so that it hurts, so that they know. I'm not quite sure why the language is again. I'm not entirely sure. One or two things, and I'll stop there. There's going to be a European network of supervisory agencies, but this body will only be facilitative. It will coordinate activities and conduct good practices under Article 21, which is fine. This is an EU directive. For God's sake, put the power there. Let this body be the one that's telling the national supervisory body, according to EU standard, you should do this. Instead of being the one that's saying, well, tell us what you're doing, tell us what you're doing. I'm not entirely sure why they create this and not make them the central hub of European policy. Again, but it's useful when you need coordination, that they will be there. So what are my final thoughts on this supervisory body? Like everything that I said, great potential. There is great mileage in here, but what kind of body are we going to get? An NCP type, and if you take the NCP type, take the Dutch NCP against the UK NCP. I'm sorry, one is great, one is rubbish. Which version are we going to get? So please define it so we know that we're not going for the Dutch type, or then we know, or give us a UK type, so we all know it's rubbish from the start. At the moment, they've left it to the countries to do whatever, so we don't know what. And I've already raised a point about appointment and selection. I need more precise definition of who can sit there. If you choose the former CEO of, General Electric, you're wasting my time. It's not going to work. Let's be clear who can sit there. The other thing is that we need, clear directions on what these sanctions are. And when these sanctions are imposed, I want to know where the victims are sitting. I want to know whether once they impose pecuniary sanctions, they're going to say 50% is going to the victims or not, or are you just going to keep it all in the victims? In the past, that's what happened. The NCP, if they kind of impose and they just keep it, well, no victims. So I need to know a little bit more. Also, I want to know the relationship, this position between this entity and the National Court. If you read Article 18, paragraph, sorry, Andrea, we're talking lawyers here. Article 18.7, and the non-lawyers, please forgive me, this is the way our minds work. It says that a company that's not satisfied with the legally binding decision of the administrative body can go to the National Court. This is the first time I'm hearing about the National Court, out of which for a clear relationship defined between the National Court and this administrative body. Suddenly the companies can go and complain. Okay, how about this bodies, the administrative body, making a decision which is, say so that it's legally binding. Which decisions are going to be legally binding according to 18.7? I don't know. So it's kind of gaps in the definition. Finally, I should say that which companies are going to be supervised is a very complicated formula. Number one, if you are an Article 2.1 company, i.e. the companies with a large turnover, it's the companies that are registered in the particular country. But if you're a small company, then if you have a branch in the country, then that country will supervise you. But if you don't have a branch and you're small, well, then let's see which country in which you generated your highest turnover in the last 12 months. Can you see where the problem is going to lie? If I do not want to be supervised by the Netherlands supervisory body, I just cut down on my turnover in Holland and go to the Italian one where they're easy. I mean, the companies are going to be moving about. Gaps all over the place. And this is a classic one. And by the way, before you forget, these companies are not going to sit there and want this thing walked over. They'll find the loopholes. So why do you even create the loopholes before the thing even kicks in? Shut them. So let's say the loopholes they find were the ones that nobody even imagined of. But these ones, we're all seeing them just like you're playing into the company. I'm sorry, this time around I sound very critical. I'm still a great fan. I think this is a game changer. Don't get me wrong. I just think we need to tidy this up a little bit. That's it.
Thank you. Michael Addo, we are so grateful for this passionate and so inspiring presentation and comments. Really, really thank you. And I have to inform that unfortunately Professor Addo has to leave us in a very few minutes as he has to take a flight.
Well,
ferry first, exactly. So it's a long trip, let's say. So we are very, very grateful to him for coming and for giving us such inspiring comments. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
So I've seen there is a lunch present. Yeah, Miss Autola, we see your hand present. Would you like to intervene now? Do you prefer me to leave you the floor afterwards?
Yeah, I can't shut. Yeah, my video is shut by the organizers, but I just wanted to say that I would need to leave in about 20 minutes. I'm very sorry. So whenever I can make some remarks, then, but I still have 20 minutes. Yeah, so whatever you decide, I just wanted to highlight this.
Yes, for sure. Please, we are.
Okay. So because I understand that we have no more new speakers in this panel, right?
No, we have finished. Unfortunately, we have.
Yeah. Yes. Okay. Then I think it's probably what you expected me to do, to say a couple of remarks, having being a part of this exciting debate and heard from all the others. So I think we all agree that the UN Guiding Principles is revolutionary because it really brings us to this new world where governments are demanding companies to be accountable for human rights. And as, for instance, Sylvia has mentioned, that there have been great pains, but also a new thinking about how environment and human rights are linked with each other. And there are multiple different relations and connections. And this all shows that the companies, but also policymakers, everybody needs a little bit more integrated thinking, that we have to understand how to solve different issues at one time and not one after the other, creating bad spillover effect. So I think if this will lead us into more integrated thinking, I think it will has served a lot of its purpose. Andrea mentioned that, no, sorry, I think it was Michael Addo who mentioned that this will also create the obvious links with human rights and trade, human rights and finance, etc. And indeed, in this way, I think if I go back to look into how the EU has evolved here, is that in 2018 came the first EU Commission's Sustainable Finance Action Plan. And that, I think, already created the link to due diligence, because it said that you cannot invest in a company sustainably and responsibly unless you know what that company is, what it contains in its value chains also. So a lot of work has been done then on how this due diligence should be worked out. And we seem to all agree also that we should not try to create some novel ideas, because we have a very solid basis in what Kofi Annan, John Ruggie and others have given us. And I think Andrea made a very good remark by saying that if the EU will manage to do it, but perhaps not quite aligned with the existing framework, then because this will have global outreach, it will have global impact, then this creates a discrepancy and problem. And that's why, that's one more reason why we have to be very careful about deviating from the guiding principles. Then I just like to sort of mention a couple of other spillover effects that there will be. First of all, this global outreach, because this directive is not only going to be addressed to European companies, it's going to be addressed to companies operating in Europe. So this immediately creates a link between other regions and countries. And I can understand that some law firms in the United States are busy trying to understand what this means to them and their clients, their companies. And I'm not sure they are all entirely happy about this, because I believe it's fair to say that the EU is now the front runner in turning the guiding principles, after all this trouble that we have seen in the EU, into sort of this what Professor Ruggie called the how did he call it? Sorry?
Smart mix.
Smart mix, yes, indeed. Yeah, so it's so hot here in Finland that my brain is going nuts. So indeed, now we have the mandatory part, and I also had a chance to work with John Ruggie during his last years, because he was extremely excited about the developments in the EU, and he saw the global outreach. So he said that now it's time for the mandatory part, in addition to the millions of different voluntary mechanisms that have been put in place. Then it will have a spillover effect to the global south. And this, of course, creates a lot of challenges. And what we in the Parliament are trying to do now is to sort of make sure that the European Commission understands that they need to give technical and development assistance to countries that are producing the goods and perhaps services that are then brought to the EU. And we have a very positive example in what we call the Sustainable Cocoa Dialogue. I was one of the initiators, but not the only one, because the biggest chocolate companies came to us in the Parliament and said, look, we cannot anymore guarantee our clients that the chocolate is free of deforestation and child labor. So please give us some mandatory legislation. So this is where we are. And the Cocoa Dialogue is a dialogue between the EU entities, civil society, EU civil society, companies, EU Commission, and then their counterparts in the producing countries. In this respect, in this question, it is about Côte d'Ivoire, Ghana, and perhaps Cameroon now also. So there is this partnership through the due diligence, because we see that the due diligence is going to put a lot of requirements to the producing countries in the global south, and we need to help them to manage that. And we can't leave it only to the companies to do. How do you get children to school? You cannot expect a chocolate company to get the children to school, but they also need to take their responsibility, and that's where the due diligence for them comes in. Okay, then we could have spoken a lot more on civil liability, but I think the starting point in the proposal for the directive is relatively okay, because now it does say that the EU member states must guarantee access to justice for a victim of a company beyond the country where the damage and the adverse impact effect happens. Of course, there will be national. We refer to national law because we do not have this solidly in international private law yet. That may come. So, but anyway, there are issues there, and for instance, we need to take into account the huge challenge of what I guess you lawyers call inequality of arms, that we need to reverse the burden of proof so that it is the company that has the burden of proof on the adverse impact and not the victim, because the victims are often very underprivileged, deprived. So maybe class actions can come there. It's not yet the case, but the EU Commissioner for Justice, Didier Reynders, he has also indicated that he's ready to discuss the class actions as a model for access to justice. So I would like to leave it to this. I think it was a great discussion, and I am sure that these administrative bodies will do their job, because not everything can be written into this directive. We also have good legislation and practice on good governance, independence and things like that. So I think some of the concerns of Michael Addo perhaps will anyway be solved through that. Not everything can be written into this directive. And it is a directive, which means that there will be some flexibility for member states to do. Right. So thank you very much for this. And I'm sure that this week has been excellent and great for everybody. And thank you, all the colleague panelists and organizers.
Ms. Autola, I thank you again also on behalf of my colleagues and of all the participants here. We are very grateful to you for your comments and mainly for the job and for the efforts you are doing in the process. So thank you very much for what you are doing. And we now feel better that you have heard which are the points on the agenda. So thank you very much again for contributing to the discussion and for the job you're doing. And now we get a little bit back to civil liability in fact and contract clauses. That is one of the three key issues in the directive. So Andrea, may I ask you? Yeah, please.
Yes, we are going to talk about that, but I'm going to start in a different place.
Okay.
Because I thought, what can I do usefully for you? I can give you a little bit of sense of the history, and I also work with companies, so I can talk to you about what I think the concrete problems are with scope of due diligence in the directive. And scope of due diligence has to do with civil liability and then contracts, and so we'll get to that. But first, you should know, historically, we had two big wins in creating the UN Guiding Principles. The first was the basis of responsibility is the company's involvement in impact, in adverse impact. That was a huge discussion for years, but we got it. So your basis of responsibility is where you find that you are involved, cause, contribution, or directly linked to impact. You covered cause, contribution, direct linkage, right? You covered that, right? Okay. Yeah. Someone asked me a question. Oh, you're stretching. Okay. So direct linkage for those lawyers in the room, there is, I won't say no legal equivalent, but it's much harder to understand that from a legal perspective, right? And when I talk with general counsels, my shorthand is saying, don't think about law. This is about something else. Right? This is beyond law. Direct linkage, right? But direct linkage is so important because it unleashes a different governance system. So did you talk about polycentric governance this week? No. Okay. John Ruggie, his idea of how to change the world was that we need a whole lot of things to happen differently. Polycentric governance. We have governance gaps. We're going to bridge them through polycentric governance. That means law and policy. That means companies, corporate governance, internal discussions change. But that means also business to business discussions change. That means civil society asks different things. Investors ask different things. Bankers and insurance companies ask different things. They all push in the same direction towards making companies do what the international standards say, right? No one law is going to do it. No one code of conduct, wherever that is going to do it, right? No one treaty is going to do it, right? He said, forget the silver bullet. You have all these things that have to change, right? In order to unleash the power of companies to make change in their context, he added direct linkage. Direct linkage says when you are linked to harm through your products, services, through business relationships, you have to use your leverage. And if you don't have it, you need to build it. Try to build it, right? And it's an obligation of conduct, not result. So I don't care if you say to me, it's worthless. You have to try, right? So why is that important? And I think that's important. And I'm just going to give you a few examples of issues that companies have been tackling because of this. Heidi mentioned chocolate. Those producers in Ghana and Ivory Coast are not in an established business relationship with Nestle or an established business relationship with your supermarkets, right? But they're the ones asking for help because they're having trouble cascading these due diligence requirements. So they're asking for help, not where their established business relationships are. They're asking for help deep down where the real problems are, where the problems are complex. And so in the directive where we see that due diligence, scope of due diligence is only your operations, your subsidiaries, and your established business relationships, you have eliminated that lever of change, right? So Coca-Cola found that about 8 layers down in their orange juice supply chain in the south of Italy, they had forced labor, almost slave labor-like conditions. They did not have established business relationships with the producers, with the producers in the south of Italy. But they did something about it. Coca-Cola did something about sugar plantations in Ecuador. And if you read their reports from 2014, they talk about direct linkage and they talk about the importance of using their leverage. That can't be cut out of the directive. It's too important. Cosmetics. So if you know about child labor and mica mining, and you know that mica goes into all kinds of cosmetics, right? Why do cosmetics companies, why are they joining initiatives with other companies that are not in their sector that are also getting mica? Because they're worried about the very complex issue of child labor in mica mines. But in the European directive, they don't have an established business relationship with the artisanal mica miners, right? Or even those that they buy from, right? It's a complex, very messy supply chain. And so why would we cut that out of the directive? Just another example. So established business relationship, is that who you buy land from? So in business and human rights, those who work in business and human rights, we know that land is a huge issue. So Indigenous people displaced by the government, perhaps. The government has a state-owned entity that then puts that land up for sale. Is that the company's problem? Under the UN guiding principles, it sure is your problem. It's direct linkage to a continuing violation, and it may be contribution. Under the directive, do you have an established business relationship with that entity that you're just going to buy land from, or the government that actually did the wrongful displacement? I don't know. So to me, the things that I've seen happen in the last 10 years with companies really getting into these messy, complex issues and using creative ways to get at those human rights issues, that could disappear if the scope of due diligence in the directive remains as it is. And that really terrifies me. And then the idea with getting to civil liability and contractual clauses, because I don't think you need to have an established business relationship to be connected to an impact. And so contracts have no place there, right? Contracts can certainly work in some areas, but you have to think about how companies work. If we're going for contractual clauses, that's something that the legal office does, and that's something that negotiators, maybe the procurement department, just automatically puts into their contracts, right? It becomes a non-issue, right? It doesn't become a discussion. And the value in my mind of putting things in contracts is not so much for what the words on the page are, it's also for what that negotiation creates and what that relationship is. So just a parenthesis, for John Ruggie, I created the Principles for Responsible Contracts, and it was on international contracts. We did not put model clauses in there. It was all about what does the negotiation relation, what does the discussion during the negotiation have to look like? So contracts for me are a bit of a red herring. And the question I have is, I understand that they wanted to tighten the scope of due diligence because they wanted to tie that to then civil liability, right? The same scope. And my question is, why do you need that to be the same scope? Your due diligence should remain international standards, keep direct linkage in there, keep all of that polycentric governance stuff working. And then civil liability can be tied to a smaller number of established business relationships or other. And then on the outer ring, where you don't have civil liability, you can have the administrative authority check on your due diligence, right? So I think that there are more creative ways to keep the value of the UN guiding principles. But right now, the scope of due diligence, if I had to pick one thing that scares me, quite frankly, it's that. Because I see that backpedaling on a huge number of really creative and innovative practices that we've developed in these 10 years. I'll stop there, thanks.
Thank you, Andrea. Now, Silvia, I know that you some other comments on civil liability and the scope of due diligence. So we would be grateful if you could tell us something more about that. This is a very critical point, actually, in the directive, and the one that has so much been discussed also by the non-governmental organizations. So please.
Yes, well, with pleasure. And I'm glad to go back to your point on that when we speak the same language, we understand each other much better, right? Because indeed, this is part of the proposals that we have been hearing on how to fix the due diligence, the civil liability aspect. But before I get to civil liability, I would like to speak on the due diligence duty, because we see that indeed it's very interconnected, and that in order to have an effective law, first we need to fix the duty. And the civil liability is a way of enforcing the duty. One way that we see this is that companies, or the civil liability is there to make sure that companies prevent the harms in the first place. So there is a lot of discussion about why civil liability is going to create a lot of, I don't know what's the word now, vicious litigation or something like that, fears of, as if in the first place, the idea is not to prevent. Communities don't want to take corporations to court. They want corporations to do no harm in their operations. So how do we get there? And it's first by looking at the due diligence duty. So one of the things that we have recommended as CCCJ, for instance, is that the directive would include a general duty to prevent. This should be modified on articles either 4 or 1. Then for the lawyers or non-lawyers, that's a little bit too specific, but that instead of going and cherry picking some of the steps and tools that companies could use in order to design this due diligence process in their companies, like contractual clauses, like third-party verification, auditing, and so on, that it would open up to the myriad of tools and steps and the possibilities of due diligence innovation that companies could have if what they're mandated to do is to establish a process in order to prevent, assess, mitigate, seize, address the impacts in the first place. So that's one very important thing for us. And in that sense, I go back quickly to the contractual assurances, third-party verifications, and auditing. We see very dangerously played the role that these three elements have in the directive, as they're very predominant when in the UNGPs or in the OECD guidelines. They're just some of an enormous list of possibilities, and they have been misused, and they're not benefiting the companies in the lower tiers of the value chain, as Andrea was rightly pointing out. One issue with the established business relationships that then goes back into how these elements is used is, for instance, we have home workers that are not in the map of many companies. H&M, I don't know, your big companies that then have a conscious brand and it's handmade, and these workers are not included. So any impacts of their business model on them is not taken into account, is not identified. It's the same for small farmers in the supply chain of Starbucks, for instance. So these contractual assurances, third-party verification, and auditing very often fails. We have millions of examples of how auditing has massively failed. There is one case that we work with, that it's the KIK case in Pakistan, that was audited by an Italian company that has not been held to account. Mm-hmm. And we see that still in the civil liability provisions of the directive, auditing companies are not held liable for their wrongdoings. So those elements that have been cherry-picked are actually the ones that where there is more information and evidence that they do not work. And we believe that this responds to possibly like a double dynamic. We see that so many small companies or companies are supporting progressive legislation, but then we also have the business associations pushing to water down the provisions in the directive. So we see a clear division in the business sector there. We see that there are some that are already walking the talk, that are already innovating in due diligence implementation. And these companies do not want the SMEs to be excluded from the value chain scope, because they know that this is not going to protect them, but it's going to put the SMEs more at the expenses or at the mercy of these contractual clauses that are made by the contracts department that has nothing to do with the due diligence or sustainability department, and that does not represent any meaningful action in terms of due diligence. And this is also an important aspect, the meaningful, what it's meaningful and what it's not. It's very vague in the directive, but the appropriate measures are very ill-defined, and this is something that also needs to be fixed in order to make the due diligence duty more efficient. And one of the things that we have identified in civil society papers, numerous of them, that could be more effective than, for instance, contractual clauses, is mandating companies to revise their own purchasing and pricing practices that are at the very origin of many of the harms that happen in their supply chains. They don't pay the orders, or they pay late, or they decide to disengage irresponsibly, and then the supplier is left dry and hanging, and they leave their workers dry and hanging without any compensation, without a severance package, et cetera, et cetera. And sometimes it's the responsibility of that practice of the company in the first place. And these elements are not taken into account as part of the identification of where the risks come from. I'm not going to repeat the gender responsiveness and stakeholder consultation part, because I think that we all kind of agree and have probably work on that. But I'm going to dwell a little bit on the part of remedy in a bit after addressing responsible disengagement. The directive does mention disengagement or even mandates companies to disengage in certain situations. And this is very much against the spirit of due diligence in the sense that there is no conception of how to responsibly and when to disengage. And it does not mandate also the companies to address the impacts that are a consequence of such disengagement. And this has become particularly relevant, I think, now in the context of the war in Ukraine. We recently published a study looking into that. What should companies do in a conflict situation to protect themselves, to protect the communities, to protect their workers they used to be or they are working with? And responsible disengagement is an extremely important part of the due diligence duty that it's not at all laid out as such, as responsible in the directive that needs fixing. We talked about the alignment with the OECD guidelines and there's different steps. So there is a mention of remedy in the steps of the due diligence duty, but it's a very narrow approach to remedy. It's only financial compensations when we have seen that very often, like there are many others of many other ways of looking at integral remedy that needs to be included in the directive as well. Yeah, I wanted to echo your point on leverage. Definitely, it is underplayed the role that leverage should have in the due diligence process right now in the directive. So to move into, because I know the time is running, into the civil liability aspects very quickly. So yeah, we do have a fault-based civil liability regime, which means that the company will be liable if the claimant can prove that because of a failure in the due diligence duty, there was a harm and that this is linked to them. So in the first place, the claimants will have to bring a substantiating claim to court, and then they will have to prove that the company did not do a proper due diligence duty and that because of that, the harm originated. This is incredibly difficult for claimants. It's almost impossible. Communities or affected people do not have the information on whether or when or what and in what manner the company did the due diligence. So this is something that we have been asking for change and for inclusion at the very beginning, the reversal or the fair distribution of the burden of proof. And this is tied then to transparency, that it's also very faulty in the directive and communication and other aspects of the transparency issues or access to information. But in the first place, burden of proof, other aspects of access to justice that are not included, such as time limitation, legal standing for NGOs or representative human rights defenders, collective redress. Many of the impacts of companies affect a community in its entirety rather than an individual, and bringing these claims as individuals is extremely costly, very long. It doesn't help in access to justice. And then there are the issues of private international law that Heidi briefly mentioned, and that we are proposing to address with an overriding mandatory provision, which make the European law overriding over the applicable law. In any case, we see that there is a problem, that it can be problematic if there are legal developments that go further, that go beyond this directive at national level elsewhere. Then the ideal case would be a choice of law. But there is a lot of issues with legal certainty on this, so we're still thinking of how to solve this part. So we see that the civil liability aspect is very important, but needs some fixing. Another thing that I think that Michael mentioned is the interaction with the sanctions and the administrative liability. And there is no mention to injunctive relief. That's another function for courts that could be explored and should be explored in the civil liability provisions. This means that then courts could ask the company to stop the activity that is causing harm, for instance, in a situation, and that's rather than going to all the end of the process of seeking remedy and so on. So I'm not going to extend myself any further, but I think that we see that the fixes that need to be done indeed are for the benefit both of the communities, preventing the harm, addressing and ceasing those behaviors from the companies that harm people and the environment, but also increasing the resilience and the legal certainty for companies. We see with the COVID-19 pandemic also how many of them were vulnerable to the breakages in the system. So it is also business smart to do due diligence right.
So, Silvia, thank you very much for the comments and for, again, advocating on those topics. So now we can open the discussion. I would like to collect the questions and then post them to the speakers. So please, yeah, can you come here? And because
just thanks. Andrea, I completely agree with you on the supply chain, on the value chain. The directive is very important because it speaks not only on upstream, but also downstream. And the downstream value chain is completely unstudied until now, because this is very, very important when I sell a product and also when the client reselling the product, and the severity of impact can be as big as up. So this is very important, but it's also a part of the world that first business doesn't want to admit that they have a responsibility downstream, and that must be studied more. But if you up or down, you even cut me at a tier 1, then it's completely nothing, because Ruggie wanted that business use their leverage to change the behavior of other business. And if you cut also tier 1, no, it's really not an alignment with the UNGPs.
thank you, Valentina.
You're welcome.
So other questions? If there's someone who wants to post one, yes, can you please come here? Yeah, we will be grateful.
So I wonder, since there's a slightly similar formulation when it comes to establish commercial relationships in the French law, if it's too early or if there's something we can learn from what has happened with that law and how it's being used, like, is there some like lesson learned from that one?
Thank you very much. Is there any other question? Can you please come to us?
First of all, I wanted to remind the remote participants that they can also pose questions if they want using the Q&A function. Yes, thank you very much for your presentations. I mean, I know both of you and the great work that you do. And of course, my question concerns climate due diligence, because I'm a bit confused, let's say, by how climate change is treated in the current draft of the directive, because the climate dimension does not seem to have been fully integrated in the due diligence provision. So we have a separate article, quite vague, uses quite general terms. I really don't think it provides the sort of guidance that businesses need. So my question is, do you think that a dimension of climate due diligence could be read by interpretation in the concept of environmental due diligence that is, let's say, contained in the due diligence definition of the directive? I ask you, I have my doubts because the Paris Agreement is not even listed among the environmental law instruments in the annex, but I would like to know
from you whether you are optimist from this point of view or whether this has the features of a missed opportunity. Thank you.
Thank you, Chiara. Is there any other questions? So we can collect maybe one or two. So please, yeah.
Yeah, thank you so much for your super comprehensive overview. I was wondering whether you could add some brief comments about the role of investors and their, I would say, place within the proposal and the future directive.
Thank you. Are there questions from the students? Okay, we have time for another question maybe, so. Okay, in this case, we can start answering. So, Andrea, would you like to start at the first one? Yes, you have to come here. Yeah.
Yeah, so thanks, Valentina, for that. I should say that in the Global Business Initiative on Human Rights, we've had a working group on customer due diligence for over a year, where the companies are actually working on that. So they do not deny whatsoever that that is part of their responsibility. It's a good start. Although they call it customer due diligence because distributors are basically thought as suppliers. So it fits in the other part. But it's really about then what's the end use? What is that? Where is that going? And just to give you some examples, I mean, you know, we've had all kinds of cases around sugar being used in chemical bombs or even medicines being used in torture. So you have lots of human rights risks, very serious human rights risks on the downstream issue, right? So on climate, I'm not sure if I'm going to answer your question very well, but yeah. I was happy just to see, where are you? I was here. I was happy just to see climate in there. And I have to say that I was just so happy to see it in there. I was just happy. Because one of the things that we've been working on with companies is trying to get them to think about human rights, environment, and climate together, right? There are structural, but also liability reasons why companies don't necessarily want to put those together. And so it's difficult, it's a challenge, but also it's a person challenge, right? You've got an environmental department, you've got a sustainability or human rights department, and they're not the same. And there's turf issues, right, too. And so you've got to navigate that. And we see that in other areas too. Diversity, equity, and inclusion is usually human resources, but a human rights approach to equality would I kind of overlap with human resources, and there's some tension there sometimes in companies. So we have to also think about how companies are made and how these things go. On the climate issue, what I would like to see, thinking about it for a redraft, I would love to see it also integrated into human rights due diligence itself. Right? Because when you're going to do a human rights analysis on a new tourism development, right? The context, here we talked about conflict context this morning. Well, the climate context, right? You're going to build things that are close to the sea. They may not survive very long, right? What is the climate adaptability plan of that government? What is happening there? So all of those things are super important, and I think it could be much better represented. And maybe you have some insights on whether it will be, and talk about Paris. The role of investors. Well, let me just say that the role of investors, I think I can give you this insight, not necessarily about the EU directive, but the role of investors is so important for companies, so important. You get the attention of a CEO when you talk about investors. And ESG is the new thing, right? And human rights has kind of been locked into the S of ESG. And what my message has been to companies and to also to CEOs has been, you know, you aren't seeing human rights being called out by investors, but it's coming. And it's going to be accelerated, I think, by the EU directive. And the thing that they're not seeing is that we now have the UN Principles for Responsible Investment, right? You have the UNPRI. They just hired their first human rights team like 8 months ago or something. So this is new. It's coming though. We have the Investor Alliance on Human Rights that have 10 trillion under management. So it's coming. It's small, but it's moving. And I think ESG will, if it can be strengthened with a human rights lens, that could also be a huge changer apart from any new directive. I'll be.
Thanks, Andrea.
Okay. Very quickly on the established business relationships and the French law. I cannot really think of a specific case right now that has been tried on this concept because in France it's very confusing as well. I think that the first battle was defining what established business relationships means in France, and still it comes from like commercial law or something like that. But one thing that I want to use the opportunity to say on this is that established business relationships, apart from all the evils that we have already identified that can derive from them, are also the source possibly of these perverse incentives for companies to cut and run, to have very short, non-lasting relationships. Because one thing that we have learned also is that, well, companies' structure and the way that they're designed and work is not given by the laws of nature. Companies decide their value chain. They decide the complex structures they have. They decide which department does what and what is the complexity level. So they could decide to change it and improve it in order to be more compliant and take really into account these risks. I think that the important part also of due diligence is that it's focused on what are the risks of the companies on the environment and on the people, not what are not these risks, how those risks affect the company in itself. So the established business relationship concept, I think, poses really, is at the very heart of this different perspective on which risks are we really trying to address here. So I'm sorry I didn't reply your question first, but thanks for giving me the opportunity to say something that I had forgotten. With regards to climate due diligence, I think that there is a lot of interest from what we have heard from several member states and MEPs into strengthening the climate aspects of it. They do want to include the Paris agreements in the directive. And the proposals that we're trying to look into is that, first of all, the definition of adverse environmental impacts is strengthened so that it's not defined by the annex, but by a paragraph in the directive in itself. And that would be linked to climate or would include climate. And in that way, then there is a better integration of the climate aspects and the environmental due diligence aspects. And that would be then linked also to the civil liability part. We do see that there is a lot of resistance, especially when it comes to very technical Paris Agreement language, like absolute emissions, so no carbon offsetting, and long-term objectives, and primarily the terms, the timeframes that we as civil society think are necessary. Like this should be enforced, and companies should be obliged to have their environmental and climate due diligence ready before 2030. We have some targets already under the Paris Agreement by 2030 that are not going to be met in the way that the directive is done, and the way that some policymakers more in the less green side of the spectrum are proposing, with a revision in 10 years after the entry into force. Like the directive is going to enter into force in 6 years, more or less, after transposition, the finalization, and so on. So by then, we're already in 2030, and we haven't even started the plans, leave alone implementing them. So I think that's going to be a battle, better integration of climate due diligence. And finally, with the investors, yes, they're super important, and companies, they have a high potential of leverage, going back to the point of leverage, but then the directive left them outside of the scope. They are they are off the hook on the definition of high-risk sectors in the scope, and they also have financial institutions, not only investors themselves, have all sorts of restrictions with regards to the due diligence duty. They are only obliged to do it pre-contract or pre-credits. So it's against the ongoing nature of the due diligence duty. So we see that the Commission has missed a massive opportunity to bring the investors on board by giving them the same duties that they're supposed to be holding their investees to account.
Thank you very much, Silvia. So we have had a great discussion, and I thank all the speakers for their interventions, for their contributions. I'm very grateful to them for their availability, for the time devoted, for their expertise devoted to our Business and Human Rights Summer School. So we are all very grateful. Now, with this roundtable, we have closed the 5th edition of the Business and Human Rights Summer School. So I would like, first of all, to ask my colleague, the co-director, to join me. We just want to remind that there is a co-director that unfortunately is not with us, Marta Bourguignon. And we thank everybody for the attention, those who are connected online, those who are here in person, and again, the speakers who have made the summer school. So thank you very much. Posso spegnere, no? Posso spegnere.